Poor people don't wear watches like that, the blonde waitress said softly, and for the first time in years, billionaire Ethan Carter forgot how to speak. Rain slid down the cafe windows in slow silver lines while the old jazz station crackled through tired speakers above the counter. Manhattan moved fast outside. Yellow cabs, wet sidewalks, men in expensive coats rushing nowhere. But inside Bellamy's cafe, everything felt slower, warmer, quiet. Ethan sat alone in the corner booth wearing a faded gray hoodie, dark jeans, and boots still damp from the storm outside. No driver, no assistant, no security team hovering nearby pretending not to stare at him. Just a man with tired eyes and a coffee growing cold between his hands. 3 months earlier, his face had been everywhere. Business magazines, podcasts, late-night television. America's youngest tech billionaire. The genius behind Carter X. The man who built a $14 billion empire before turning 35. And then came the scandal. Not financial. Worse. Personal. Photos leaked online of his ex-fiancée, leaving a hotel in Aspen with another billionaire while Ethan was overseas closing a merger in Singapore. The headlines mocked him for weeks. The internet turned his heartbreak into entertainment. But what stayed with Ethan wasn't the betrayal itself. It was what she told him afterward. I love the life around you more than I ever loved you. Those words followed him everywhere now. In elevators. In penthouses. In silent rides through Manhattan at midnight. So Ethan disappeared. Not completely. Billionaires never truly disappeared. But he stopped attending galas. Stopped answering interviews. Stopped being Ethan Carter the Empire. He rented a small apartment in Brooklyn under another name, and spent his evenings wandering through parts of the city where nobody expected power to walk in wearing old sneakers. That was how he found Bellamy's cafe. And that was how he met Claire Bennett. She moved quietly behind the counter with practiced grace, carrying plates through crowded aisles while steam curled around her like soft fog. Mid-20s. Pale skin. Light blonde hair tied loosely behind her neck. No heavy makeup. No fake smile. Her eyes noticed things most people missed. Ethan realized that on his third visit, most customers barely looked at him. To them, he was another tired guy trying to survive New York rent. But Claire watched differently. Calmly. Carefully. Tonight, she placed his black coffee down without writing the order first. No sugar, she said. And the turkey sandwich without tomatoes. Ethan looked up slowly. You remembered. You always pick them out anyway. Her voice stayed even, almost absent-minded, but there was intelligence behind it. The kind that stayed quiet because it didn't need attention. Ethan gave a small smile. Guess I'm predictable. Claire glanced briefly at his left wrist as he reached for the coffee cup. Just 1 second. Barely noticeable. But Ethan saw it. The watch. A vintage Patek Philippe worth more than most cars. One of the only expensive things he still wore because it had belonged to his father. Her eyes lingered there before meeting his again. Then came the sentence that made his chest tighten. Poor people don't wear watches like that. Silence settled between them. Even the rain seemed quieter. Ethan stared at her across the dim cafe lights while she calmly folded a receipt beside the register. No accusation in her voice. No greed. No excitement. Just observation. Sharp. Precise. Dangerous. Ethan leaned back slowly. Maybe it's fake. Claire smiled faintly for the first time. Not impressed. Not fooled. No, she said softly. Fake watches don't carry that much sadness. And somehow, that sentence hit harder than every headline written about him combined. Ethan did not sleep that night. The city lights stretched across the ceiling of his small Brooklyn apartment, while Claire's words replayed in his mind over and over again. Fake watches do not carry that much sadness. Most people saw the surface first. The car. The money. The headlines. They saw success the way tourists saw Manhattan from the top of Rockefeller Center. Bright. Distant. Impressive. But Claire had looked at him for less than 10 seconds and somehow noticed the one thing he spent years hiding from the world. Loneliness. The radiator hissed softly beside the window while rain tapped against the glass in uneven rhythms. Ethan loosened the old leather strap of his watch and stared at it under the dim kitchen light. His father had worn it every day for almost 30 years. Board meetings, hospital visits, family dinners. Ethan still remembered sitting beside him as a child in their Connecticut house while the old man explained how real wealth worked. Money buys privacy. His father once told him quietly. But love only survives honesty. At the time, Ethan thought it sounded poetic. Now it felt like a warning he understood too late. The next evening, Bellamy's cafe smelled like cinnamon coffee and fresh bread when Ethan walked in again around 7:30. Claire stood near the register counting bills from an elderly customer while soft jazz floated through the speakers overhead. She looked tired tonight. Not physically, emotionally. The kind of exhaustion that lived behind someone's eyes long before it reached their body. Ethan noticed she rubbed her wrist absent-mindedly while organizing menus. Tiny details. He had spent years studying billion-dollar negotiations, yet lately all his attention drifted towards small things about a waitress in Manhattan. Claire glanced up when the bell above the cafe door rang. Their eyes met briefly. No surprise crossed her face, almost as if she had expected him to return. "Black coffee?" she asked. Ethan nodded slowly. "And the turkey sandwich?" A faint smile touched her lips. "Without tomatoes." He sat in the same corner booth while rainwater darkened the shoulders of his hoodie. Outside, people hurried through the cold October evening with umbrellas tilted against the wind. Inside Bellamy's, time moved differently. Slower. Softer. Ethan watched Claire work while steam curled around the espresso machine beside her. She greeted every customer with quiet patience, even the rude ones. Especially the rude ones. A man in an expensive navy coat snapped his fingers at her 20 minutes later because his latte was taking too long. Ethan felt irritation tighten his jaw immediately. The old version of himself would have ended the conversation with one phone call to the cafe owner. But Claire simply walked over calmly and placed the drink down without changing her expression. "Extra hot. 2 sugars," she said gently. The man barely thanked her before returning to his phone. Ethan shook his head slightly. "You should have charged him double for attitude." Claire looked over while wiping the counter. Then half of Manhattan would go bankrupt. Ethan laughed quietly before catching himself. It startled him sometimes, how easy laughter felt around her. Claire carried his sandwich over a few minutes later and slid the plate onto the table beside his coffee. "Long day?" she asked. Ethan leaned back against the booth. "Something like that." "Construction? What makes you think that?" "Your hands." She nodded toward them. "They are too clean for mechanics. Too careful for delivery work. But you have tension in your shoulders like someone who spends all day fixing problems." Ethan stared at her for a second. "You profile everyone like this?" "Only the interesting ones." Silence settled softly between them after that. Comfortable silence. Rare silence. The kind Ethan almost forgot existed. Claire glanced toward the front window as another gust of rain rattled against the glass. "You know," she said quietly, "most rich people try very hard to look rich." Ethan's heartbeat slowed slightly. "And poor people?" Claire folded a receipt carefully before answering. "Sometimes they try very hard not to look broken." Her words landed gently, but they stayed there. Heavy. Ethan looked down at the coffee cup, warming his hands. He had built skyscrapers worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Bought companies before breakfast meetings. Sat beside senators and celebrities and investors who called him brilliant. Yet somehow this quiet blonde waitress with tired eyes and careful observations made him feel more exposed than any journalist ever had. Claire reached for the empty sugar container near his table. Their hands brushed accidentally for half a second. Nothing dramatic. No music swelling in the background. Just warmth. Human warmth. But Ethan noticed the way she pulled her hand back slowly instead of immediately. As if she felt it too. Then the cafe. Television mounted above the counter suddenly changed from baseball highlights to financial news. Ethan froze instantly when his own company logo flashed across the screen. The television screen flickered softly above the counter while the financial anchor adjusted his glasses beneath the bright studio lights. Carter X shares continue climbing despite CEO Ethan Carter remaining absent from public appearances for nearly 12 weeks. Ethan's stomach tightened instantly. On screen, his own face appeared beside the company logo. Sharp suit. Controlled expression. Cold blue eyes trained by years of boardrooms and cameras. The version of himself the world recognized. Claire looked up from the register slowly. Around the cafe, a few customers barely paid attention before returning to their meals. But Ethan felt the air shift anyway. Heavy. Dangerous. He reached for his coffee cup too quickly, nearly spilling it across the table. Claire noticed. Of course she noticed. She always noticed. The anchor continued speaking. Sources close to Carter-X say the billionaire founder has completely withdrawn from Manhattan social circles following his highly publicized breakup earlier this year. Ethan stood abruptly. I should go. Claire's eyes moved from the television back to him. Calm. Thoughtful. Not shocked. Somehow that unsettled him more. Your sandwich is not finished, she said quietly. Ethan forced a small smile that did not reach his eyes. Suddenly lost my appetite. He reached into his pocket for cash, but Claire placed the check face down before he could pull out his wallet. It is already covered. Ethan frowned slightly. By who? By the man who tips $20 every night for a $6 coffee. The corner of her mouth lifted faintly. Apparently, he is not struggling as much as he pretends. Ethan stared at her for a long second. There it was again. That feeling. Not judgment. Not admiration. Understanding. Which somehow felt far more intimate. Outside, rain still fell across Manhattan in silver streaks as Ethan stepped toward the cafe door. He should leave. He knew that. This entire experiment depended on distance. Simplicity. No attachments. No truth. But his hand stopped on the cold metal handle when Claire spoke again behind him. You know what the strange thing is? Ethan turned slowly. Claire rested both hands lightly on the counter beneath the warm cafe lights. I recognized you 3 weeks ago. Silence. Even the dishes clinking in the kitchen seemed far away now. Ethan looked at her carefully. How? Claire shrugged slightly. My roommate follows business magazines like Celebrity Gossip. She nodded toward the television. The face was familiar. Ethan let out a slow breath through his nose. And you never said anything? You never asked. Her answer came gently. Simple. Honest. Ethan laughed quietly despite himself. Most people would have reacted differently. Most people see money first. Claire reached for a clean coffee mug beside the register. I saw someone hiding. The words settled deep inside him. Ethan walked back toward the booth slowly this time, lowering himself into the seat across from the rain-covered window. Claire carried over a fresh cup of coffee without asking if he wanted one. She placed it in front of him carefully before sitting in the opposite booth for the first time since they met. Outside, headlights blurred across wet streets while steam curled upward between them. So, Ethan said quietly, why keep pretending not to know? Claire traced one finger slowly along the edge of the ceramic mug. Because for the first time since you started coming here, you looked relaxed. Ethan looked down at the coffee. Dark. Steaming. Honest. You make me sound broken. Claire tilted her head slightly. You say that like it is something shameful. He did not answer immediately. Somewhere near the kitchen, an old Frank Sinatra song drifted softly through the cafe speakers. Ethan realized he could not remember the last time he sat somewhere without checking emails every 30 seconds. The last time someone spoke to him without wanting access to his money, influence, or last name. Claire watched him quietly for another moment before speaking again. You know what gave you away first? Ethan glanced up. The watch. No, her eyes softened slightly. The way you thank people. Ethan blinked. Once. What? Rich men who grew up rich usually expect service. Claire folded a napkin carefully between her hands. But every time I refill your coffee, you look surprised someone did something kind for you. Ethan felt something tighten painfully in his chest at those words. Because she was right. Somewhere along the line, kindness stopped feeling normal in his life. Everything became transactions. Contracts. Angles. Conditions. Even love. Claire stood slowly when another customer entered through the front door, bringing cold wind and rain inside with him. Before walking away, she looked back once over her shoulder. You do not have to keep pretending here, Ethan. Her voice stayed soft. Safe. Nobody in this cafe cares how much money you have. Then she paused briefly before adding, including me. Ethan watched her disappear behind the counter while warm light reflected softly across the cafe windows. And for the first time in months, the billionaire who owned half the skyline of Manhattan realized he was terrified of losing something money could never buy back. The next morning, Manhattan woke beneath a pale gray sky and the smell of rain still lingering on the sidewalks. Ethan stood outside Bellamy's cafe longer than usual before walking in. His phone vibrated twice inside his jacket pocket. He ignored it both times. By now, half his executive team was probably panicking over his continued disappearance from public life. Quarterly meetings, investor calls, acquisition deadlines, problems worth billions of dollars waiting for signatures only he could approve. None of it felt urgent anymore. not compared to the strange calm he found inside a small cafe with flickering lights and chipped ceramic mugs. The bell above the cafe door chimed softly as he entered. Claire looked up immediately from behind the counter. She wore a cream-colored sweater beneath her black apron today, her blonde hair loosely tied back, while morning sunlight filtered faintly through the windows behind her. "You came early," she said. Ethan glanced toward the nearly empty cafe. "Guess I wanted coffee before the rest of Manhattan remembered how stressful life is." Claire smiled slightly, while reaching for a mug. "Black coffee. You already know the answer." Steam rose between them as she poured it carefully. Ethan noticed the faint shadows beneath her eyes again. Tiredness. Real tiredness. The kind no amount of sleep fully fixed. He leaned lightly against the counter instead of sitting down this time. "Do you ever take a day off?" Claire handed him the coffee before answering. "Not everyone owns companies worth $14 billion. Ethan winced slightly. "You looked that up?" "I read one article." She shrugged. "Then the internet did the rest." Ethan lowered his eyes to the coffee cup in his hands. "And?" Claire studied him quietly for a moment. "Honestly, always. You look happier here." The answer caught him off guard. Outside, taxis splashed through rainwater while pedestrians rushed past carrying umbrellas and paper cups. But inside Bellamy's, silence settled comfortably around them again. Ethan noticed a stack of textbooks partially hidden beneath the register beside Claire. Economics, accounting, business law. He glanced toward them curiously. "College." Claire followed his gaze. "Night classes." "For what?" "Trying to finish my finance degree eventually." Ethan looked genuinely surprised. "Finance?" Claire laughed softly at his expression. "You sound offended." "No, just curious." She wiped down the counter slowly while speaking. "I had to leave school 2 years ago when my mom got sick." Her voice stayed calm, but Ethan noticed the tiny pause before the word sick. Medical bills came first. Ethan's eyes moved instinctively toward her wrist again. This time he noticed the faded marks left behind by cheap elastic gloves. Long hours. Hard work. Quiet sacrifice. "So Bellamy's pays the bills." Claire nodded once. "Mostly. And the rest." "I tutor high school students in math on weekends." Ethan stared at her for a second longer than necessary. She noticed that too. "What?" she asked softly. Ethan shook his head faintly. "Nothing." But it was not nothing. Because somewhere between the coffee stains on the counter and the textbooks hidden beneath receipts, Ethan realized Claire was the exact opposite of every person he spent the last decade surrounding himself with. No performance. No strategy. No manipulation hidden beneath polished smiles. Just resilience wrapped in quiet dignity. The cafe door suddenly opened behind him, bringing in cold wind and a sharply dressed man carrying an expensive umbrella. Mid-40s. Navy overcoat. Silver cufflinks. Ethan recognized him instantly. Daniel Brooks, one of the senior executives at Carter-X. Ethan turned away immediately toward the counter, lowering his face slightly. Too late. Daniel froze near the entrance. "Mr. Carter?" Claire looked between them in confusion, while Ethan closed his eyes briefly under his breath. Daniel approached quickly, disbelief written across his face. "Jesus, we have been trying to reach you for weeks." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Not here." Daniel lowered his voice slightly, but still looked stunned by the sight of the billionaire standing inside a small cafe in Brooklyn wearing an old hoodie. The board meeting got moved again. Investors are getting nervous. Claire stepped back politely, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Ethan noticed it immediately. The distance. Subtle, but there. Daniel glanced toward Claire and then back at Ethan with growing confusion. "Wait," he said carefully. "You actually work here?" Claire crossed her arms lightly. "Last time I checked." Daniel laughed awkwardly. "Sorry. I just did not expect." He stopped himself too late. Ethan saw the moment Claire understood exactly what he meant. Not cruel. Just class divide. The invisible wall money created between people without them even noticing. Claire's expression stayed composed, but something behind her eyes dimmed slightly. Ethan straightened slowly. His voice turned colder now. Sharper. "Daniel." The executive immediately looked back at him. "Apologize." Silence fell across the cafe. Daniel blinked once before clearing his throat awkwardly. "I did not mean anything disrespectful." "Still," Ethan said firmly, "apologize." Claire looked at Ethan then. Really looked at him. Not the billionaire. Not the disguise. The man. Daniel finally nodded toward her. "I am sorry." Claire gave a small, polite smile. It is fine. But Ethan knew it was not. Because, for the first time since hiding from the world, he realized something uncomfortable. Pretending to be poor was easy when you could always leave. Claire never had that luxury. After Daniel left the cafe, silence lingered in the air like steam after fresh coffee. Ethan remained near the counter while Claire quietly organized sugar packets into neat rows without looking directly at him. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving Manhattan wrapped in cold silver light and wet sidewalks reflecting traffic signals like scattered pieces of glass. Ethan slid his hands into the pockets of his hoodie. Claire. She kept working for another second before answering softly. You do not have to explain anything. I want to. That finally made her look up. Her blue eyes stayed calm, but something had changed since Daniel walked in. Not anger. Distance. Small but real. Ethan recognized it immediately because he had spent years watching people create distance around him the moment money entered the room. Claire leaned lightly against the counter. You know the strange part? She asked quietly. I was starting to forget you were rich. Ethan let out a humorless laugh. Trust me, I was trying to forget too. She studied him for a moment before nodding toward the booth near the window. Sit. I still have 15 minutes before lunch rush destroys my will to live. Ethan smiled despite himself and walked back toward the corner booth, while Claire brought over 2 coffees this time instead of 1. She sat across from him again, tucking one leg slightly beneath her chair while the cafe hummed softly around them. So, she said gently, what exactly does a billionaire do all day when he disappears from the world? Ethan wrapped both hands around the warm mug. Mostly avoid mirrors. Claire's lips curved faintly. That bad? Worse. He looked down briefly before continuing. You ever spend years building something so big that eventually people stop seeing you and only see what you own? Claire did not answer immediately. Ethan noticed she always listened fully before speaking. I think, she said carefully, that happens to people without money too. Ethan looked up. Claire traced small circles along the coffee mug with her fingertips. When my mom got sick, everyone suddenly started treating me like a struggling waitress instead of Claire. Her smile turned sad around the edges. It is strange how fast people simplify you once life gets hard. Ethan felt those words settle somewhere deep inside him. Because that was exactly what happened after the breakup. Suddenly, he stopped being a person too. He became headlines, net worth estimates, public embarrassment. What happened to your mom? He asked softly. Claire lowered her eyes toward the table. Multiple sclerosis. Ethan's chest tightened slightly. I am sorry. Yeah. She smiled gently, but tiredly. Me too. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The cafe around them filled slowly with lunchtime customers while old jazz music drifted through the speakers overhead. Somewhere behind the counter, dishes clinked softly together. Small sounds. Human sounds. Ethan realized he preferred this noise over the silence of his penthouse apartment. Claire looked back at him eventually. Can I ask you something honestly? Always. Why pretend to be broke? Ethan leaned back slowly. Because the last woman I loved knew my net worth before she knew my favorite color. Claire blinked once at that. Ethan stared out the rain-streaked window while speaking quietly. I spent years wondering whether people cared about me or just the life around me. He laughed softly under his breath. Turns out heartbreak gets really expensive when lawyers and tabloids get involved. Claire watched him carefully now. Not with pity, with understanding. So Bellamy's was your hiding place? Ethan nodded once. At first. And now? Ethan looked directly at her then. Now it is the only place where I do not feel lonely. The honesty in his voice surprised even him. Claire lowered her gaze briefly toward her coffee cup, and Ethan noticed the faint pink color touching her cheeks before she spoke again. You know, she said softly, you are actually very bad at pretending to be poor. Ethan raised an eyebrow. That obvious? You say thank you too much. You open doors automatically. You stand up when older people walk into the room. She smiled faintly. And your shoes cost more than my monthly rent. Ethan laughed quietly. Real laughter this time. Warm. Claire laughed too. And for one brief moment, the rest of Manhattan disappeared completely. Then the cafe door swung open hard enough to rattle the hanging bell above it. 3 young women entered carrying shopping bags and expensive coats, talking loudly until one of them suddenly froze mid-sentence. Her eyes locked directly onto Ethan. Oh my God, she whispered sharply. The other 2 immediately turned toward him. Ethan's expression changed instantly. Claire noticed it at once. The tension in his shoulders. The careful mask returning behind his eyes. One of the women stepped forward excitedly. "You are Ethan Carter." Several nearby customers looked up from their tables now. Phones started appearing almost immediately. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the coffee mug in front of him, while Claire quietly took in the entire room. The whispers, the attention, the sudden shift in energy. One of the women smiled brightly. "Can we take a picture with you?" Ethan looked exhausted suddenly. Not annoyed. Exhausted. Before he could answer, Claire stepped calmly beside the booth. Her voice stayed polite, but firm. "He is trying to have lunch." The woman blinked awkwardly. "We just wanted one quick photo." Claire held her ground gently. "And he said no." Ethan looked up at her slowly then. Something warm moved across his face. Gratitude. Real gratitude. Because in a city obsessed with power and fame, Claire Bennett had just done something nobody had done for Ethan Carter in a very long time. She protected his peace instead of trying to borrow it. The woman lowered her phone awkwardly after Claire spoke, clearly surprised someone would deny access to a billionaire in the middle of Manhattan. Around the cafe, whispers still floated between tables while customers pretended not to stare directly at Ethan. Claire remained calm beside the booth, one hand lightly resting against the back of the empty chair across from him. "Sorry," one of the women muttered before guiding her friends toward another table near the windows. Ethan released a slow breath through his nose once they walked away. "You did not have to do that." Claire looked down at him with quiet confusion. "Do what?" "Protect me." A faint smile touched her lips. "I was protecting the rest of us from hearing camera clicks during lunch." Ethan laughed softly under his breath, but his eyes stayed on her longer than necessary. Something shifted between them then. Small. Invisible to everyone else in the cafe. But real. Claire glanced toward the growing line of customers near the register. "I should work before my manager realizes I have spent 20 minutes talking to one customer. One very loyal customer. You tip too much to quit now." She walked away before Ethan could answer, but he noticed the tiny smile she tried to hide as she disappeared behind the counter. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. Rain clouds drifted beyond the cafe windows while Manhattan settled into its usual restless rhythm. Ethan stayed longer than normal, pretending to check emails on his phone while secretly watching Claire move between tables with quiet efficiency. She remembered regular customers by name, refilled coffee before anyone asked, smiled gently at exhausted parents with screaming toddlers. There was something graceful about the way she carried exhaustion without letting it harden her. Around 4 o'clock, the lunch crowd finally thinned enough for the cafe to breathe again. Claire dropped into the booth across from Ethan with a tired sigh and stretched her wrist carefully. Ethan noticed immediately. "You should rest more." That is adorable coming from a billionaire who lives on coffee and emotional repression. Ethan smiled faintly. "Fair point." Claire leaned her head lightly against the booth behind her. "You know, I used to think rich people lived easy lives." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And now I think lonely people exist in every tax bracket." The honesty in her voice settled softly between them. Ethan studied her face beneath the warm cafe lights. She looked beautiful when she stopped trying to hide how tired she was. Real. Human. Dangerous in a completely different way than the women he used to date at charity galas and private rooftop parties. Because Claire made him want simplicity instead of admiration. Ethan looked away first. "You ever think about leaving New York?" Claire laughed quietly. "Every winter. I mean seriously." She thought about it for a moment while tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "Sometimes." Her voice softened slightly. "But my mom loves it here." "Where is she now?" "Physical therapy appointment in Queens." Claire smiled gently. "She keeps pretending she is getting stronger faster than she actually is." Ethan nodded slowly. "Sounds stubborn." "Very." Claire's eyes warmed faintly. "I get it from her." Ethan believed that immediately. The cafe door opened again, bringing cold air swirling inside along with a tall man wearing a charcoal overcoat and polished leather shoes. Mid-50s. Silver hair. Sharp posture. Ethan stiffened slightly the moment he saw him. Claire noticed the reaction at once. "Friend?" she asked quietly. Ethan's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Unfortunately, the man spotted Ethan near the booth and walked over with controlled irritation written across his face. "There you are." Ethan leaned back slowly. "Hello to you too, Richard." Claire glanced between them carefully. "Richard Hale." senior board member at Carterex and one of the most powerful investors in Manhattan. His sharp eyes shifted briefly toward Claire before returning to Ethan. We need to talk. Ethan stayed seated. Then talk. Richard lowered his voice slightly. The board is losing patience. Investors are asking questions. You vanished for 3 months, Ethan. And somehow the company survived without me setting the world on fire. Richard ignored the sarcasm. This is not funny. His gaze drifted toward Claire again, lingering just a second too long on her waitress uniform. Especially if this is the reason you disappeared. The cafe suddenly felt colder. Ethan's expression changed immediately. Claire noticed it before Richard did. The warmth vanished from Ethan's face completely. Careful, Ethan said quietly. Richard raised an eyebrow. I am trying to help you. No, Ethan replied calmly. You are trying to judge someone you do not know. Claire looked down briefly toward the table, uncomfortable now. Richard sighed impatiently. Ethan, come on. You built a $14 billion company, and now you are hiding in Brooklyn cafes, pretending to be normal. Ethan stood slowly from the booth. Not angry. Worse. Disappointed. You know the saddest part? He asked quietly. I spent years believing people like you understood success. Richard folded his arms. And now? Ethan glanced once toward Claire before answering. Now I think dignity matters more. Silence fell heavily between them. Richard looked genuinely caught off guard by that response. Ethan reached for his jacket calmly. Tell the board I will return next week. Richard blinked once. You will? Yes. Ethan slipped his phone into his pocket. But if anyone speaks disrespectfully about Claire again, I walk permanently. Claire's eyes lifted toward him instantly. Richard looked stunned. Ethan did not wait for a response. He simply turned toward Claire beside the booth. His voice softened immediately when speaking to her. You get off work at 7? Claire nodded slowly, still processing everything that just happened. Ethan gave a small, tired smile. Then let me buy you dinner somewhere nobody knows my name. Claire stood motionless for several seconds after Ethan left the cafe that evening. Outside, Manhattan glowed beneath cold amber streetlights while taxis drifted through wet intersections like slow-moving reflections. Around her, Bellamy's returned to normal almost immediately. Coffee orders, dishes clinking, customers checking phones. But Claire still felt the weight of Ethan's words lingering in the air beside the booth near the window. Let me buy you dinner somewhere nobody knows my name. Most women would have said yes instantly. Billionaire. Handsome. Powerful. The kind of man magazines called unattainable. But Claire knew enough about loneliness to recognize danger when she saw it. Not danger from Ethan himself. Danger from what happened when people started needing someone too much. Earth to Claire. Her co-worker Jenna waved a hand in front of her face near the register. You okay? Claire blinked lightly before grabbing another stack of menus. Fine. Jenna lowered her voice dramatically. That was Ethan Carter. Apparently. Jenna almost choked on her own coffee. Claire, the man owns half of Manhattan. Claire glanced toward the rain outside the windows. And yet he still drinks terrible diner coffee every morning. Jenna stared at her in disbelief. You actually like him. Claire stayed quiet too long. That alone answered the question. Jenna softened immediately. Careful, she said gently this time. Men like that live in different worlds. Claire forced a faint smile. I know. But the problem was she was no longer sure Ethan belonged in that world anymore either. 7 o'clock arrived quietly. Bellamy's finally emptied enough for the exhaustion in Claire's body to fully settle into her shoulders. She untied her apron slowly near the back hallway while staring at her reflection in the small employee mirror beside the lockers. Pale blue sweater. Tired eyes. Loose blonde hair falling around her face after a 10-hour shift. Nothing about her belonged beside billionaires and boardrooms. Yet somehow Ethan looked more at peace sitting across from her in a diner booth than he probably ever did inside penthouses overlooking Central Park. Claire grabbed her coat and stepped outside into the cold evening air. Ethan waited across the street beneath the glow of an old bookstore sign with his hands in the pockets of a dark wool coat. No driver. No security. No black SUV lined along the curb. Just him. He looked up the moment he saw her. And smiled. The kind of smile that arrived slowly, like something unfamiliar returning after years away. Claire crossed the street carefully while autumn wind lifted strands of blonde hair around her face. You actually stayed, Ethan said softly once she reached him. Claire raised an eyebrow. You sound surprised. I am. She studied him for a second beneath the city lights. You really have trust issues. Ethan laughed quietly under his breath. Occupational hazard. They walked side by side through Manhattan without rushing anywhere specific. For the first few blocks, neither of them spoke much. The city filled the silence for them instead. Car horns echoing through wet streets. Steam rising from subway grates. Couples laughing beneath umbrellas outside tiny restaurants glowing gold against the cold night. Ethan eventually glanced toward her. You hungry? Claire nodded once. Depends on whether this is billionaire dinner or normal person dinner. Ethan looked genuinely offended. I will have you know I can enjoy reasonably priced pasta. Claire laughed softly for the first time all evening. That sounded rehearsed. It absolutely was. 20 minutes later, they ended up inside a tiny Italian restaurant tucked between a laundromat and an old jazz bar in Brooklyn. Nothing expensive. Red brick walls. Candlelight flickering softly between tables. Frank Sinatra humming through dusty speakers overhead. Claire looked around in surprise after they sat down near the back window. This place is nice. Ethan loosened his coat slightly. My father used to bring me here when I was a kid. Claire blinked once. Seriously? Back before money turned every meal into a networking opportunity. His voice softened slightly at the memory. A waitress approached their table carrying menus, but paused abruptly the second she recognized Ethan. Claire noticed the exact moment the atmosphere shifted again. Surprise. Excitement. Curiosity. The waitress smiled nervously. Mr. Carter, it is such an honor. Ethan smiled politely, but Claire saw the exhaustion immediately return behind his eyes. Just Ethan tonight. The waitress nodded quickly before hurrying away toward the kitchen, whispering excitedly to another employee. Claire watched Ethan lower his gaze toward the candle between them. Does that ever get exhausting? She asked quietly. Ethan looked up. What? Being recognized everywhere. He thought about the question longer than expected. It is not the recognition. His fingers rested lightly against the water glass beside him. It is wondering whether people still see you after they recognize you. Claire felt something tighten gently in her chest at those words. Because suddenly she understood the real reason Ethan hid inside Bellamy's cafe every day. It was never about pretending to be poor. It was about trying to feel ordinary enough to be loved honestly. Ethan glanced toward her across the candlelight. Can I ask you something? Claire nodded softly. Why did you never treat me differently after finding out who I was? She looked at him quietly for a moment before answering. Because the saddest thing about you was never your money. Ethan's expression softened slightly. Claire smiled gently across the table. It was how relieved you looked every time someone forgot about it. For the first time in years, Ethan forgot to check his phone during dinner. It stayed face down beside his water glass while candlelight flickered softly across the table between him and Claire. Outside the restaurant windows, Brooklyn moved slowly beneath cold autumn air and blurred streetlights. Inside, everything felt warm enough to make the rest of the world disappear for a while. Claire twirled pasta carefully around her fork before glancing up at him. Your board members probably think you got kidnapped. Ethan smiled faintly. Honestly, some of them would prefer that over me making emotional decisions. And disappearing into cafes? Especially that. Claire laughed softly, and Ethan realized he had started memorizing the sound of it. The way it arrived quietly at first before fully warming her face. The way her shoulders relaxed whenever she forgot to carry the weight of responsibility for a few seconds. He liked who she became when life stopped exhausting her. That realization frightened him more than he expected. The waitress returned briefly with another basket of bread before nervously asking for a quick photo with Ethan near the front counter. He hesitated almost automatically, but Claire touched his wrist lightly beneath the table. Go, she said gently. She seems nice. Ethan studied her face for a second. No jealousy, no fascination with status, just kindness. He stood slowly and walked toward the counter while Claire remained alone at the table near the candlelight. Across the restaurant, Ethan smiled politely for the picture while the young waitress thanked him repeatedly. Claire watched quietly from a distance. He looked comfortable pretending confidence for strangers. But she noticed the small things now. The exhaustion behind his eyes afterward. The way he immediately loosened his shoulders once the attention ended. Ethan returned to the table a minute later. Sorry. Claire shook her head softly. You are very patient. Years of practice. Still. She smiled faintly. Most rich men I meet cannot even wait 2 minutes for extra ketchup. Ethan laughed under his breath. You really hate rich people. No. Claire rested her chin lightly against her hand. I hate entitlement. The honesty in her voice settled softly between them. Ethan looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. You know, he said quietly, you are probably the first person who ever spoke to me like this. Claire raised an eyebrow. Like what? Normally. She looked genuinely confused by that. How else would I talk to you? Ethan stared down briefly at the candle flickering between them. Exactly. Silence followed, but not uncomfortable silence. Warm silence. The kind that slowly wrapped itself around two people before they realized they were becoming important to each other. Claire eventually glanced toward the old watch resting against Ethan's wrist. Your father gave you that? Ethan looked surprised. How did you know? You touch it every time you talk about something painful. He blinked once at that observation. Claire smiled softly. You really should stop underestimating waitresses. Ethan laughed quietly again before his expression softened at the memory. He wore it every day. His fingers brushed lightly across the worn leather strap. Even in the hospital. Claire's eyes gentled immediately. He passed away? Ethan nodded once. 5 years ago. The restaurant noise faded around them for a moment. Cancer, Ethan added quietly. I was in London closing a deal when the doctors called. Claire lowered her eyes. I am sorry. Ethan leaned back slowly. The worst part is I almost stayed for the meeting. Claire looked up sharply at that. Ethan laughed softly without humor. Yeah. His voice dropped lower. Turns out money trains you to believe everything is urgent until life proves otherwise. Claire watched him carefully beneath the candlelight. There it was. Again. Not arrogance. Regret. Deep regret wrapped inside expensive watches and billion-dollar companies. Ethan met her gaze eventually. That is why I disappeared after the breakup. Claire stayed quiet, letting him continue. At first I blamed her. He stared toward the restaurant window where rain began falling lightly again outside. Then I realized I built a life where people learned to value me incorrectly. Claire's chest tightened slightly at the honesty in his voice. Ethan looked back at her slowly. I do not know who I am without all of it anymore. Claire held his gaze steadily across the table. I think you do. Ethan frowned slightly. What makes you say that? She smiled softly. Because every time you forget about being Ethan Carter, you become Kinder. Those words stayed between them quietly while rain tapped against the restaurant windows. Ethan looked at her as though she had just said something nobody else in his entire life ever noticed before. Then his phone suddenly vibrated sharply against the table. Once, twice, 3 times. Ethan glanced down reluctantly. Claire noticed his expression change immediately. Tension returning. Reality finding him again. The screen lit up with over 20 missed calls and a message from Daniel Brooks. Emergency board meeting. Media found the Brooklyn apartment. Reporters already outside Carter X headquarters. Claire lowered her eyes toward the phone. Your world found you again. Ethan stared at the message silently for several seconds before finally locking the screen. Then he looked back at Claire across the candlelight. I do not want to go back. Claire's expression softened painfully because for the first time since meeting him, Ethan Carter did not sound like a billionaire at all. He sounded like a tired man asking permission to stay where he finally felt safe. Rain followed them back into Manhattan that night, like the city itself was trying to hold Ethan there a little longer. Neither of them spoke much during the drive across the bridge. Soft jazz played quietly through the car speakers while blurred headlights stretched across wet streets outside the windows. Claire sat beside him watching the city pass by in silver reflections. Ethan kept one hand loosely against the steering wheel while the other rested near his phone, though he never looked at it again. Somewhere around midnight, he parked outside Claire's apartment building in Queens. Small brick building. Faded awning. Laundry lights glowing across the street. Nothing glamorous. Real life. Ethan turned off the engine slowly, and silence settled warmly inside the car. Claire looked down at her hands for a moment before speaking softly. You should probably go home. Ethan stared through the windshield. I do not think home exists right now. Claire's chest tightened gently at those words. Ethan finally looked at her then. Tired blue eyes. Honest eyes now. No billionaire mask left between them anymore. Claire, he said quietly, what if I do not want that life back? She studied him carefully before answering. You do not hate your life, Ethan. Her voice stayed gentle. You hate who you became while surviving it. He looked away briefly because the truth in those words hurt more than criticism ever could. Claire reached for the door handle slowly, but Ethan spoke again before she opened it. "Will I see you tomorrow?" She smiled faintly without looking back at him. "You know where the coffee is." Then she stepped out into the rain and disappeared beneath the glow of the apartment entrance lights. Ethan stayed parked there for almost 10 minutes afterward, watching the empty sidewalk where she had stood. The next morning, Manhattan exploded. News helicopters hovered above Carter-X headquarters, while financial reporters crowded the sidewalks outside the glass tower downtown. Billionaire CEO Ethan Carter resurfaces after months of disappearance. Sources claim internal conflict at Carter-X. Questions grow regarding Carter's leadership stability. The world Ethan left behind waited for him exactly where he abandoned it. Loud, demanding, hungry. Ethan stood inside his Brooklyn apartment wearing a pressed charcoal suit for the first time in months. It felt strange on him now, heavy somehow. His reflection stared back from the mirror near the hallway. Perfect tie, perfect posture. Billionaire again. But his eyes looked different now, less empty. His phone vibrated with another message from Daniel Brooks. Boardroom, 10 a.m. Do not disappear again. Ethan slipped on his father's watch slowly before leaving the apartment. The board meeting lasted 3 exhausting hours. Investors argued. Executives panicked. Lawyers discussed public image recovery strategies while giant windows overlooked the Manhattan skyline Ethan once considered proof of success. Ethan listened quietly through most of it. Then Richard Hale finally leaned forward across the polished conference table. The media believes your disappearance was caused by emotional instability. Ethan stared calmly at the city beyond the glass windows. Maybe it was. Several board members shifted awkwardly at the honesty in his voice. Richard frowned. Ethan, perception matters. Ethan looked back at him slowly. No, his voice stayed calm, but firm. Results matter. Humanity matters. The rest is public relations. Silence spread across the room. Ethan stood from the table and adjusted the sleeve of his suit. I built this company believing success required sacrificing everything personal. His eyes moved briefly around the boardroom. I was wrong. Daniel watched him carefully now. What are you saying? Ethan slipped both hands into his pockets. I am saying Carter-X survives because people inside this company are exhausted pretending money matters more than life. Nobody spoke. Nobody interrupted. Because for the first time in years, Ethan Carter sounded less like a billionaire and more like a man finally telling the truth. 2 hours later, Ethan stood outside Bellamy's cafe again while rain drifted lightly across Manhattan sidewalks. Inside, Claire wiped down tables near the windows while afternoon jazz floated softly through the cafe speakers. She looked up when the bell above the door chimed. Ethan stepped inside wearing the expensive charcoal suit from the board meeting. Several customers recognized him immediately, whispering beneath their breath while glancing toward phones and news alerts. But Ethan ignored all of it. His eyes only found Claire. She smiled softly the moment she saw him. You survived. Ethan walked toward the counter slowly. Barely. Claire noticed the folded paper receipt resting in his hand. What is that? Ethan placed it gently on the counter between them. Claire unfolded it carefully. Her eyes widened slightly when she recognized it immediately. The old Bellamy's receipt from weeks earlier. 1 black coffee. 1 turkey sandwich without tomatoes. $20 paid by Claire the night Ethan forgot his wallet on purpose to continue pretending he was broke. Ethan looked at her quietly beneath the warm cafe lights. You once told me poor people try hard not to look broken. Claire's expression softened. Ethan smiled faintly. Turns out billionaires do too. Silence settled gently between them while rain tapped softly against the windows. Then Ethan pulled another $20 bill from his pocket and slid it beside the receipt. I came back to pay my debt. Claire laughed quietly through the emotion rising in her eyes. That is all. Ethan shook his head slowly. No, his voice softened. Honest now. Completely honest. I came back as the only version of myself you ever really loved. Claire looked at him for several seconds without speaking. Then she reached across the counter and took his hand gently in hers while the noise of Manhattan blurred into the background once again. And somewhere between the coffee steam, the rain outside, and the silence they shared together, Ethan Carter finally understood something his father tried to teach him years ago. The rarest thing in the world was never wealth. It was finding someone who could still see the human being underneath it.